Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most bizarre and terrifying episodes, the dancing plague of 1518, when an entire city lost its collective mind and decided that involuntary choreography was the way to go. We're talking about a mass outbreak of uncontrollable dancing that literally killed people, because apparently medieval Europe looked at all the normal ways to die, plague, war, famine, being trampled by horses, and said, you know what? Let's add fatal boogie fever to the list. So before we waltz into this nightmare, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me explain how hundreds of people danced themselves to death while their neighbors hired live bands to encourage them. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm particularly curious if anyone's watching this from Strasbourg itself, because that would be both poetic and slightly concerning. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on some music. Actually, scratch that. Maybe don't put on music after you hear this story. And let's ease into tonight's journey together through one of the most inexplicable disasters in human history. So, you think mass hysteria is just people overreacting to things on social media? Charming. Truly, like assuming a medieval dance party was just people having a really good time, right up until they started dropping dead from exhaustion. Tonight, we're exploring the summer of 1518, when Strasbourg became the stage for history's deadliest flash mob, and the city's solution to people dancing themselves to death was to hire professional dancers and musicians. Because nothing says medical intervention like providing live entertainment for your own apocalypse. Buckle up, because this story has everything: inexplicable compulsions, medieval medical incompetence, religious authorities completely losing the plot, and enough psychological horror to make you never want to hear music again. We're about to discover why sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural beings or foreign armies, but your own body deciding it has other plans for your evening that don't include staying alive. Picture this: it's July 1518, and Strasbourg is sweating like a guilty person in confession. The sun has decided to cosplay as Satan's armpit, and the city is about as pleasant as a medieval toilet during festival season. The cobblestones are hot enough to fry an egg, if anyone had eggs to spare, which they didn't, because life in the Holy Roman Empire was basically a competition to see who could survive on the least amount of everything while paying the most taxes to people who already had too much of everything. Now, enter Frau Trophia, a woman whose name history remembered, not because she invented something useful or married someone important, but because she stepped out of her house one steamy July morning and decided to dance. Not the kind of dancing you do at weddings when your cousin plays the lute too loudly. No. This was dancing with the desperate intensity of someone trying to shake off invisible demons, or possibly trying to physically remove herself from the timeline entirely. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely terrifying, in that special medieval way where everything that doesn't make sense immediately becomes God's fault, or the devil's entertainment. Frau Trophia didn't just dance for a few minutes and then go home to complain about her feet. She danced like her life depended on it, which, spoiler alert, it apparently did, just not in the way anyone expected. Her husband, whose name history forgot, because apparently being married to the first documented case of fatal dancing wasn't enough to secure your place in the historical record, tried everything short of physically tackling his wife to make her stop. He pleaded, he reasoned, he probably offered her favourite meal, which in 1518 Strasbourg was likely some form of bread soup with a side of more bread. Nothing worked. Frau Trophia kept dancing like she was possessed by the ghost of every festival that had ever been cancelled due to war, plague, or general medieval misery. The neighbours, because medieval neighbours were basically the original social media, gathered to watch this spectacle. At first, they probably thought it was mildly entertaining, a brief respite from the usual medieval entertainment options, which were watching paint dry, literally watching paint dry, because there wasn't much else to do, and theological debates about whether enjoying anything was a sin. Some probably laughed. Others crossed themselves. A few likely placed bets on how long she could keep it up, because humans have always been exactly as awful as you'd expect. But then something happened that turned this from a neighbourhood oddity into the kind of historical event that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality. Other people started dancing. Not joining involuntarily, mind you. They were compelled, dragged into the rhythm like iron filings to a magnet. Except the magnet was inexplicable, and the iron filings were human beings who really didn't want to be iron filings. By the end of the first week, dozens of people were dancing. By the end of the month, hundreds. And here's the thing that would make this entire situation hilarious, if it weren't so horrifying. These people couldn't stop. They weren't having the time of their lives. They weren't expressing joy or celebrating anything. They were trapped in their own bodies, forced to dance until their feet bled, until they collapsed from exhaustion, until some of them literally danced themselves to death. Imagine being trapped in a body that won't obey you, that insists on moving to music only you can hear, music that apparently sounds like the soundtrack to your own destruction. Your legs keep moving even when you beg them to stop. Your arms flail without your permission. Your heart pounds not from excitement, but from terror and exhaustion. You're dying in the most absurd way possible, and everyone's watching, and no one can help you. And the worst part is that some people think you're doing it on purpose. The city officials, those paragons of medieval wisdom and efficiency, looked at this situation and came to the only logical conclusion clearly: the solution to uncontrollable dancing was more dancing. They hired professional dancers and musicians, set up stages, and essentially turned the whole thing into the world's most macabre festival. Their reasoning, if you can call it that, was based on the medical wisdom of the time, which suggested that the dancing was caused by hot blood, and that the victims would eventually dance it all out of their systems, like sweating out a fever, but with more choreography and significantly more death. This was roughly equivalent to seeing someone drowning and deciding the best course of action was to push them into deeper water, so they could really commit to the experience. The city's solution was to encourage the very thing that was killing people, which takes the medieval talent for making everything worse and elevates it to an art form. The professional musicians played, the professional dancers demonstrated proper technique, and the involuntary dancers continued their horrific marathon, now with live accompaniment. Picture the scene: dozens of people locked in a compulsive dance, their faces twisted in exhaustion and terror, while hired entertainers pranced around them providing what officials presumably thought was helpful guidance. It was like a nightmare directed by someone who had fundamentally misunderstood the assignment. Meanwhile, the physicians, those medieval masters of medical guesswork, debated the cause with all the confidence of people who thought bloodletting was a reasonable response to most ailments. Some blamed the alignment of the planets, because in 1518, if something went wrong and you couldn't immediately blame someone you didn't like, you blamed celestial bodies. Others suggested it was caused by corrupted air, which was the medieval equivalent of blaming literally everything on pollution, except they had no concept of pollution, so they just made something up. The more religiously inclined citizens, which in 1518 Strasbourg was basically everyone except for the handful of people who were too busy dying to properly fear God, decided this was obviously divine punishment for the city's sins. They organized prayer sessions, processions, and probably a few public confessions of sins that had nothing to do with dancing, but seemed relevant because medieval logic was less about logic and more about finding increasingly creative ways to feel guilty about everything. But what sins had Strasbourg committed to deserve this particular punishment? Was God angry about the quality of the local bread? Had someone been charging too much for candles? Had the city failed to properly venerate some saint whose feast day they'd forgotten? The religious authorities went through the possibilities like detectives, trying to solve a cosmic crime. Except the only evidence was a bunch of people who couldn't stop moving, and a general sense that God was probably upset about something. Some blamed moral corruption, pointing to instances of gambling, drinking, or the occasional outbreak of happiness that hadn't been properly sanctified by the church. Others suggested it was punishment for political sins, because Strasbourg, as a free imperial city, was constantly navigating the treacherous waters of Holy Roman Empire politics, trying to maintain independence while not offending any of the various powerful people who could destroy them on a whim. The most creative theologians suggested it was a test, like Job's trials, except instead of losing his family and possessions, the people of Strasbourg were being tested by having to watch their neighbours dance themselves to death, while professional musicians provided a soundtrack. This interpretation required a level of mental gymnastics that would have been impressive if it weren't being used to explain away mass involuntary dancing. As the weeks passed, the dancing continued, and the death toll mounted. People collapsed from exhaustion, their hearts giving out from the constant exertion. Others died from dehydration, their bodies unable to keep up with the demands of endless movement. A few simply seemed to die from the psychological trauma of being trapped in their own rebellious flesh, their minds breaking under the strain of helplessness. The families of the dancers were trapped in their own kind of hell. They watched their loved ones destroy themselves and could do nothing to help. Imagine watching your spouse, your parent, your child dance themselves to death while the city hired musicians to accompany their dying. The helplessness must have been overwhelming, the guilt crushing. Did they somehow cause this? Could they have prevented it? Should they try to physically restrain their loved ones? Or would that make things worse? Some families tried intervention, holding down the dancers, tying them to beds, locking them in rooms. But the compulsion was stronger than physical restraint. The dancers would break free or dance in place, or simply exhaust themselves struggling against their bonds until they were too weak to survive. There was no winning, no solution that didn't involve watching someone you loved suffer. The economic impact was almost as devastating as the human cost. Strasbourg's economy ground to a halt as hundreds of people became unable to work, their families became consumed with caring for them, and the city spent its resources on musicians and stages instead of productive activities. Trade slowed, shops closed, and the normal rhythm of daily life was replaced by the constant, horrifying rhythm of the dance. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole situation was how quickly it became normalized. After a few weeks, people adapted to living in a city where some percentage of the population was dancing themselves to death at any given moment. They learned to navigate around the dancers, to conduct business while stepping over collapsed bodies, to have conversations over the sound of exhausted weeping and relentless footsteps. This adaptability speaks to something deeply unsettling about human nature, our ability to normalize absolutely anything if it goes on long enough. The dancing plague became just another part of life in Strasbourg, like taxes or bad weather or the occasional outbreak of actual plague. People who had initially been horrified by the sight of involuntary dancing learned to treat it as background noise, a regrettable but manageable part of their daily routine. Children grew up thinking this was normal. They played games imitating the dancers, not out of cruelty, but because children imitate what they see, and what they saw was adults moving in strange, compulsive ways. They learned to speak around the subject, to avoid mentioning dance in polite conversation, to pretend that the screaming and crying and dying happening in the streets was just another part of growing up in a free imperial city. The psychological toll on the non-dancing population was enormous but largely unrecorded. Historical accounts focus on the dancers themselves, but what about everyone else? What about the people who had to clean up after the collapsed dancers, who had to maintain some semblance of normal life while their city descended into inexplicable madness? What about the people who lived in constant fear that they might be next, that they might wake up one morning with an irresistible urge to dance until they died? Some people left the city entirely, packing up their lives and relocating to places where the local population wasn't engaged in a mass death dance. But most stayed, either because they couldn't afford to leave, or because they had no way else to go, or because they held on to the hope that this madness would end as suddenly as it had begun. The religious authorities, meanwhile, were working overtime to find a spiritual solution to what they had decided was a spiritual problem. They organized special masses, brought in holy relics, and encouraged increased devotion to various saints who were thought to have influence over dancing-related ailments. Yes, apparently medieval Christianity had developed saints with very specific areas of expertise, including saints who specialized in involuntary movement disorders. Saint Vitus was particularly popular during this period, being the patron saint of dancers, and people suffering from dancing mania. The irony of praying to the patron saint of dancers to stop people from dancing was apparently lost on everyone involved, or perhaps they thought Saint Vitus would appreciate the professional consultation. Religious processions were organized in his honor, with the non-dancing population marching through the streets in elaborate displays of piety, while the dancing population continued their own, less voluntary procession. The church also organized mass confessions, reasoning that if the dancing was divine punishment for sin, then the solution was to confess all sins and hope for forgiveness. This led to some awkward moments, as people confessed to increasingly minor infractions in the hope of finding the specific sin that had triggered God's wrath. Someone confessed to enjoying their dinner too much. Someone else admitted to having uncharitable thoughts about their neighbor's new hat. The confessional lines were longer than usual, filled with people desperately trying to remember every minor moral failing that might have contributed to the cosmic dance crisis. But the most telling aspect of the religious response was how it revealed the fundamental powerlessness of medieval institutions in the face of the inexplicable. The church, which claimed to have answers for everything, could only offer the same generic solutions they applied to every problem: pray more, confess more, donate more, and hope God's mysterious ways would eventually make sense. They were as baffled as everyone else, but they couldn't admit it without undermining their entire authority structure. The secular authorities were equally helpless, but more willing to admit it. The city council met repeatedly to discuss solutions, and their records reveal a kind of bureaucratic desperation. They tried banning public gatherings, reasoning that maybe the dancing was somehow contagious through proximity. They tried imposing curfews, hoping to limit the hours during which people could be compelled to dance. They even tried changing the city's official schedule, as if the dancing might be somehow tied to the normal rhythm of daily life. None of it worked. The dancing continued regardless of laws, schedules, or civic ordinances. It was as if the city's normal systems of control and organization were simply irrelevant to whatever force was compelling people to dance. This was terrifying for the authorities, who built their entire identity around the belief that they could manage and control their population's behavior. The economic disruption continued to cascade through every aspect of city life. Bakers couldn't bake if they were dancing. Merchants couldn't trade if they were collapsed from exhaustion. Craftsmen couldn't craft if their hands were busy flailing to unheard music. The city's productivity plummeted, and with it, the tax revenue that kept the local government functioning. Some entrepreneurial citizens tried to profit from the situation. They sold cushions for the dancers to collapse on, charged admission for people to watch the dancing, and even offered betting pools on which dancers would last the longest. This combination of tragedy and commerce was quintessentially medieval, reflecting a society that had learned to find economic opportunity in absolutely everything, including mass death by dancing. Others tried to help in more charitable ways. They brought water to the dancers, tried to catch them when they fell, and organized informal support networks for the families affected by the plague. These efforts were largely futile, but revealed the better aspects of human nature, the impulse to help even when helping seemed impossible. The medical community, such as it was in 1518, was completely out of its depth. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to result from imbalances in these humors, and treatment involved attempting to restore balance through diet, bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies. But the dancing plague didn't fit neatly into this framework. It wasn't clearly a matter of too much hot blood or corrupted phlegm. The symptoms didn't match any known disease, and traditional treatments had no effect. Some physicians tried bloodletting, reasoning that the dancing might be caused by an excess of hot blood that needed to be drained. This had the predictable result of making already exhausted dancers even weaker, hastening their deaths without stopping the dancing. Others tried dietary interventions, prescribing specific foods thought to cool the blood or balance the humors. They recommended avoiding spicy foods, eating more vegetables, and drinking certain herbal teas. Again, this had no effect on the dancing, but did provide a sense that something was being done. which was perhaps more for the comfort of the observers than the dancers themselves. The most creative physicians hypothesized that the dancing was caused by music that only the dancers could hear, perhaps supernatural music that was calling them to dance. This theory led to attempts to counteract the invisible music with real music, which is how the city ended up hiring professional musicians in the first place. The logic was that good, holy music might overpower whatever evil music was compelling the dancers. This approach backfired spectacularly. Instead of stopping the dancing, the live music seemed to energize the dancers, making their movements more frenzied and exhausting them even faster. It was as if the musicians were providing a soundtrack to a horror movie, making the whole situation more intense and terrible rather than resolving it. Some physicians, running out of conventional treatments, turned to increasingly desperate measures. They tried exorcism, reasoning that the dancing might be caused by demonic possession. They tried astrological remedies, calculating the positions of the planets and prescribing treatments based on celestial influences. They even tried sympathetic magic, creating dolls that resembled the dancers and performing various rituals on the dolls in the hope that this would somehow affect the real people. None of it worked. The dancing continued, and people continued to die. And the medical establishment was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that they had no idea what was happening or how to stop it. This was particularly devastating in a society that placed enormous faith in the authority of learned men and established institutions. Meanwhile, the dancers themselves were experiencing something that no one around them could truly understand. Historical accounts describe their faces as showing a mixture of terror and ecstasy, as if they were simultaneously horrified by their situation and compelled by something greater than themselves. Some reported hearing music that no one else could hear. Others claimed to see visions of saints or demons encouraging their movement. The psychological experience of being trapped in your own body, unable to control your actions, must have been indescribable. Imagine knowing that you're dancing yourself to death and being powerless to stop. Imagine feeling your feet bleeding in your shoes, your muscles cramping, your heart racing, and being unable to rest. Imagine watching your family's faces as they realize they can't help you, can't save you from whatever force has taken control of your body. Some dancers tried to communicate with their families during brief moments of relative calm, gasping out messages of love or farewell between bouts of frenzied movement. These conversations were heartbreaking, filled with the desperate intensity of people who knew they were dying in the most absurd way possible and had only moments to say everything they needed to say. Others seemed to lose the ability to speak coherently, as if the dancing had consumed not just their bodies but their minds as well. They babbled incoherently, sang fragments of songs, or simply made wordless sounds of exhaustion and despair. The loss of language seemed to represent the ultimate surrender to whatever force was controlling them, the final abandonment of human agency. The physical toll was horrific. The dancers' feet became bloody and swollen, their muscles strained beyond endurance, their joints inflamed from constant movement. Some developed what would now be recognized as symptoms of severe dehydration and malnutrition, as their bodies consumed energy faster than it could be replaced. Others showed signs of what modern medicine would identify as cardiac stress, their hearts struggling to keep up with the demands of endless exertion. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how some dancers seemed to adapt to their condition, finding ways to conserve energy and survive longer. They developed more efficient movements, learned to rest while still maintaining the minimum motion that seemed to be required, and found brief moments of respite during which they could drink water or communicate with their families. This adaptation was both hopeful and horrifying, suggesting that some people might be trapped in this state indefinitely. The social dynamics of the dancing plague were equally complex. The dancers formed an involuntary community, united by their shared affliction, but unable to truly support each other. They were isolated by their condition, even while being surrounded by other dancers. Some seemed to find comfort in the presence of fellow sufferers, while others appeared to be competing with each other, as if the dancing were a contest that could only be won by being the last person still moving. The non-dancing population, meanwhile, was divided between those who showed compassion for the dancers and those who viewed them with suspicion or contempt. Some people genuinely believed the dancers were innocent victims of supernatural forces or divine punishment. Others suspected them of faking their condition for attention or to avoid work responsibilities. This suspicion was particularly cruel, given that people were literally dying from their dancing. But it reflected the medieval tendency to view inexplicable events with paranoia and blame. Class distinctions played a role in how the dancing plague was perceived and experienced. Wealthy dancers had families who could afford to hire servants to watch over them, bring them food and water, and ensure they didn't injure themselves when they collapsed. Poor dancers often had to rely on charity or simply suffered alone, with their families unable to afford to take time off work to care for them. The wealthy were also more likely to be able to afford medical attention, though as we've seen, medical attention in 1518 was often more harmful than helpful. Still, the perception that the rich were receiving better care created resentment among the general population, adding class tension to an already stressful situation. Some wealthy families tried to hide their affected relatives, locking them in private rooms where their dancing wouldn't be visible to the public. This worked about as well as you'd expect, which is to say not at all, since the compulsion to dance was stronger than locked doors or family shame. It did, however, create a population of hidden dancers, people whose suffering was invisible to the official record keepers, but no less real for being private. The gender dynamics were also significant. Historical records suggest that women were more likely to be affected by the dancing plague than men, though this might reflect reporting bias rather than actual susceptibility. Women's bodies were already viewed with suspicion in medieval society, seen as more susceptible to supernatural influences and less capable of rational self-control. The dancing plague reinforced these prejudices, with some commentators suggesting that women's weaker nature made them more vulnerable to whatever forces were causing the dancing. This gendered interpretation of the plague had real consequences for how female dancers were treated. They were more likely to be viewed as morally suspect, as if their condition reflected some spiritual failing or sinful behavior. Male dancers, by contrast, were more often seen as victims of external forces, their masculinity making it inconceivable that they would choose to dance themselves to death. These gender biases affected treatment as well. Female dancers were more likely to be subjected to religious interventions designed to address supposed moral failings, while male dancers were more likely to receive medical attention focused on physical causes. Neither approach was effective, but the disparity reveals how even in the face of inexplicable tragedy, medieval society managed to maintain its existing prejudices and power structures. Children were affected too, though their experience of the dancing plague was somewhat different from that of adults. Young dancers often lasted longer, their smaller bodies requiring less energy to maintain constant movement. But they were also less able to understand what was happening to them, making their suffering particularly heartbreaking for observers. Some children seemed to treat their dancing almost like a game at first, until exhaustion and pain made it clear that this was not play. Others were terrified from the beginning, crying inconsolably while their bodies moved against their will. The sight of dancing children was apparently one of the most disturbing aspects of the plague for contemporary observers, representing an innocence corrupted by forces beyond understanding or control. Families with dancing children faced impossible choices. Do you restrain a child who is compelled to dance, knowing that restraint might harm them, but hoping it might save their life? Do you provide food and water to sustain a child through what might be a prolonged period of involuntary dancing? Do you try to maintain normal family routines around a child who can't stop moving, or do you abandon all pretense of normalcy? There are records of parents taking shifts to watch over dancing children, trying to catch them when they fell, providing water during brief moments of stillness, and singing lullabies that the children couldn't hear over whatever music was compelling their movement. These acts of care were both touching and futile, representing the human need to do something helpful even when nothing helpful was possible. The educational system, such as it was, completely broke down during the plague. Children who weren't dancing couldn't concentrate on their lessons while their classmates were compelled to move constantly. Teachers struggled to maintain order in classrooms where some students were dancing and others were trying to hold normal classes. Many schools simply closed, adding educational disruption to the economic and social chaos. Religious education was particularly affected, as church services became impossible to conduct normally when some portion of the congregation was dancing involuntarily. Priests tried to adapt, shouting prayers over the sound of dancing feet and incorporating the dancers into services as a kind of physical prayer. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful and often made the situation more chaotic rather than more sacred. The artistic community responded to the dancing plague in various ways. Some musicians refused to perform, fearing that their music might somehow contribute to the problem. Others threw themselves into their work, creating new compositions inspired by the rhythms they observed in the dancers' movements. These pieces were often beautiful, but deeply melancholy, reflecting the tragic nature of their inspiration. Visual artists documented the plague in paintings and sketches, creating some of the most haunting medieval art ever produced. These works show dancers in various stages of exhaustion and ecstasy, their faces twisted by the competing demands of their compulsion and their humanity. The art serves as a record of an inexplicable event, but it also captures something essential about human suffering and endurance. Writers struggled to find words for what they were witnessing. How do you describe the indescribable? How do you make sense of senseless tragedy? The literary works produced during and after the dancing plague are characterized by a kind of linguistic inadequacy, as if the writers were pushing against the limits of what language could express. Some writers turned to religious imagery, describing the dancers as martyrs or saints, their involuntary movements transformed into a kind of holy suffering. Others used military metaphors, portraying the dancers as soldiers in a war against invisible enemies. Still others abandoned metaphor entirely, simply trying to record the facts of what they observed without attempting to explain or understand it. The legal system also struggled to adapt to the dancing plague. What do you do when citizens are breaking laws against public disturbance, but they're doing so involuntarily? How do you prosecute someone for disturbing the peace when they literally cannot control their actions? The courts were faced with cases that had no precedent and no clear resolution. Some judges tried to apply existing laws, fining families for their relatives' disruptive behavior or ordering dancers to be removed from public spaces. But these legal remedies were meaningless when applied to people who had no control over their actions. You can't fine someone into stopping involuntary dancing, and you can't imprison someone whose body won't stop moving. Other judges took a more compassionate approach, suspending normal legal proceedings for dancers and their families, recognizing that the law was simply inadequate to address this situation. This suspension of normal legal order was both necessary and troubling, representing a breakdown of one of the fundamental systems that held medieval society together. The dancing plague also created new categories of legal problems. Who was responsible for caring for dancers who collapsed in public? What happened to property owned by people who danced themselves to death? Could contracts be voided if one party was compelled to dance instead of fulfilling their obligations? The legal system was forced to improvise solutions to problems that had never existed before. Some innovative lawyers tried to argue that the dancing plague constituted an act of God that voided normal contractual obligations. This argument had mixed success, depending on whether judges were willing to accept supernatural explanations for what they were witnessing. The legal precedents established during this period influenced how future inexplicable events would be handled by the courts. Trade and commerce were devastated not just by the loss of dancing workers, but by the general atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that pervaded the city. Merchants from other cities were reluctant to visit Strasbourg, fearing they might somehow catch the dancing compulsion. Local businesses struggled to operate normally when a significant portion of their customer base was either dancing or caring for dancers. Some entrepreneurs tried to adapt their businesses to the new reality. Inns began offering special accommodations for families with dancing relatives, providing large rooms where dancers could move freely without disturbing other guests. Restaurants started offering portable meals that could be consumed quickly during brief moments when dancers were able to eat. The medical supply business boomed, as people desperately sought any remedy that might help their dancing loved ones. Herbal remedies, religious relics, and folk cures were sold at premium prices to families willing to try anything. Most of these products were useless, but they provided a psychological comfort that was perhaps worth the expense. The funeral industry also had to adapt, as the dancing plague created a steady stream of deaths from exhaustion and related complications. Funeral directors developed new protocols for handling bodies that had died from extreme physical exertion, and gravediggers worked overtime to keep up with demand. The constant presence of death added to the general atmosphere of despair and fear that characterized Strasbourg during this period. International relations were affected as well. Other cities and regions viewed Strasbourg with suspicion and fear, unsure whether the dancing plague might spread beyond the city's borders. Trade relationships were disrupted, diplomatic visits were cancelled, and Strasbourg found itself increasingly isolated from the broader European community. Some cities imposed quarantine restrictions on travellers from Strasbourg, requiring them to wait outside city walls for specific periods to ensure they weren't carrying the dancing compulsion. These measures were probably ineffective, but reflected the general fear and uncertainty about how the plague might spread. The Holy Roman Empire's imperial authorities were initially reluctant to intervene, viewing the dancing plague as a local problem that Strasbourg should handle on its own. But as the situation continued and reports spread throughout the empire, pressure mounted for imperial action. The emperor's advisors debated whether to send military assistance, medical experts, or religious authorities to address the crisis. Ultimately, the imperial response was limited and ineffective, consisting mainly of official prayers and declarations of support that did nothing to help the actual dancers. This lack of effective imperial intervention reinforced Strasbourg's sense of isolation and abandonment during the crisis. The psychological impact on the city's leadership was enormous. Mayor, city council members, and other officials were accustomed to dealing with problems that had solutions, even if those solutions were difficult or expensive. The dancing plague presented them with a problem that seemed to have no solution at all, challenging their fundamental understanding of governance and leadership. Some officials broke under the pressure, resigning their positions or suffering what would now be recognized as mental health crises. Others doubled down on their efforts to find solutions, working frantically to try different approaches even when previous attempts had failed. The stress of leadership during an inexplicable crisis took a toll on everyone involved in city government. The religious leadership faced similar challenges. Priests and bishops were expected to provide spiritual guidance and comfort. But how do you counsel someone whose body is betraying them in ways that no one understands? How do you explain God's plan when that plan seems to involve innocent people dancing themselves to death? Some religious leaders experienced crises of faith, questioning whether their understanding of divine will was adequate to address what they were witnessing. Others became more fervent in their religious observance, convinced that greater devotion would somehow resolve the crisis. Still others began to doubt the very foundations of their belief system, wondering whether a good God would allow such inexplicable suffering. The international scholarly community eventually took notice of the Strasbourg dancing plague, with learned men from universities across Europe writing treatises attempting to explain the phenomenon. These scholarly works reveal the limitations of medieval knowledge and the desperate human need to find rational explanations for irrational events. Some scholars blamed astrological influences, creating elaborate charts showing how the positions of planets and stars might have created conditions conducive to mass dancing. Others focused on medical explanations, developing increasingly complex theories about humoral imbalances and corrupted air. Still others took theological approaches, situating the dancing plague within broader frameworks of divine judgment and human sin. These scholarly explanations were largely wrong, but they served an important psychological function for medieval society. They provided the comfort of believing that learned authorities understood what was happening, even when those authorities were essentially guessing. The mere existence of scholarly explanations helped people feel that the world was still fundamentally comprehensible, even when their immediate experience suggested otherwise. As the plague continued into its second month, the city began to adapt to its new reality in ways that were both pragmatic and disturbing. New social norms developed around the dancers. People learned to conduct conversations and business while stepping around collapsed dancers. Children learned to play games that incorporated the constant background sound of dancing feet. Merchants developed new ways of conducting transactions that could be completed quickly during the brief periods when dancer customers were able to stand still. These adaptations were necessary for the city to continue functioning, but they also represented a kind of normalization of tragedy that was psychologically troubling. The fact that people could adapt to living with mass involuntary dancing suggested something both resilient and disturbing about human nature. Some families developed elaborate care routines for their dancing relatives, creating systems of shifts and support that allowed them to provide constant attention, while still maintaining some semblance of normal life. These routines were exhausting and emotionally draining, but they provided a sense of purpose and control in an otherwise helpless situation. Other families simply couldn't cope with the demands of caring for dancing relatives and either abandoned them to public care or left the city entirely. These decisions were heartbreaking but understandable, reflecting the impossible choices that the dancing plague forced upon ordinary people. The city's religious calendar was completely disrupted as normal worship services became impossible when significant portions of the congregation were compelled to dance. Some churches experimented with modified services that incorporated the dancers as a kind of living prayer, but these attempts were generally unsuccessful and often made the situation more chaotic. Other churches simply closed their doors during the plague, their priests unable to figure out how to conduct meaningful worship under such extraordinary circumstances. This abandonment of religious observance was particularly traumatic for a deeply religious society that looked to the church for guidance and comfort during times of crisis. The educational system never really recovered during the plague period. Schools that remained open struggled with classrooms where some students were dancing and others were trying to learn normally. Teachers found it impossible to maintain attention and discipline under such circumstances, and most educational institutions simply suspended operations until the crisis passed. This educational disruption had long-term consequences for an entire generation of Strasbourg children who missed crucial learning opportunities during the plague period. Some families tried to maintain private tutoring, but even this was difficult when tutors or students might be compelled to dance at any moment. The economic consequences continued to cascade through every aspect of city life. Tax revenues plummeted as businesses failed and workers became unable to work. The city government struggled to maintain basic services while dealing with the additional costs of caring for the dancers and their families. Some industries completely shut down during the plague, unable to operate safely or effectively with dancing workers. Others tried to adapt, developing new work processes that could accommodate workers who might suddenly be compelled to dance. These adaptations were often inefficient and sometimes dangerous, but they represented the desperate creativity of people trying to survive under extraordinary circumstances. The plague also created new forms of employment. People were hired to watch over dancers, to clean up after them when they collapsed, and to provide whatever care and comfort was possible. These jobs were both necessary and heartbreaking, requiring workers to witness constant suffering while being largely unable to help. Medical professionals from other cities began to arrive in Strasbourg, drawn by curiosity about the plague and hope that they might be able to provide effective treatment. These visiting physicians brought new ideas and approaches, but they were no more successful than the local medical community in stopping the dancing or saving the dancers. Some of these visiting physicians took detailed notes on what they observed, creating medical records that are among the most valuable historical sources for understanding the dancing plague. Their outside perspective allowed them to see patterns and details that local observers might have missed, though their treatments were no more effective than those of local doctors. The arrival of outside medical experts also created tension within the local medical community, as local physicians felt their competence was being questioned by the presence of outside specialists. This professional tension added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. Religious pilgrims also began arriving in Strasbourg, some seeking to witness what they believed was a miraculous or supernatural event, others hoping to provide spiritual assistance to the afflicted. These pilgrims created additional chaos in a city already overwhelmed by crisis, filling the streets with people who gawked at the dancers like tourists at a particularly morbid attraction. Some pilgrims claimed to have special healing powers or divine insight into the cause of the plague. They performed elaborate rituals, prayed loudly in public spaces, and generally made nuisances of themselves while contributing nothing useful to the actual care of the dancers. Their presence was particularly galling to families who were watching their loved ones die, while strangers treated the situation as an opportunity for spiritual tourism. Other pilgrims were more sincere in their desire to help, bringing food, water, and genuine compassion to the suffering dancers and their families. These well-meaning visitors often had no more idea how to help than anyone else, but their kindness provided some small comfort in an otherwise desperate situation. The international attention also brought scholars and chroniclers who wanted to document the plague for posterity. These observers took detailed notes, made sketches, and interviewed witnesses, creating the historical records that allow us to know about the dancing plague today. Their work was valuable from a historical perspective, but their presence as neutral observers while people were dying added a surreal quality to the situation. Some chroniclers seemed more interested in the plague as an intellectual curiosity than as a human tragedy, asking invasive questions and treating the dancers like specimens to be studied rather than people to be helped. This clinical detachment was perhaps necessary for creating objective records, but it was painful for families who were grieving and desperate. As summer turned to autumn, the plague began to show signs of waning, though not in any way that anyone could predict or control. Some dancers simply stopped dancing, collapsing into exhausted sleep from which they eventually woke apparently cured. Others continued dancing but with less intensity, their movements becoming slower and less frenzied before gradually ceasing altogether. The recovery process was almost as mysterious as the plague itself. Dancers who had been compelled to move for weeks or months would suddenly find themselves able to sit still, as if whatever force had controlled them had simply lost interest. There was no pattern to these recoveries, no treatment that seemed to trigger them, no warning that they were about to occur. Some recovered dancers had no memory of their dancing period, waking up confused and disoriented with no understanding of how much time had passed or what they had experienced. Others retained full awareness of their ordeal, but seemed psychologically intact despite their traumatic experience. Still others were permanently changed, suffering from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, unable to hear music or see dancing without experiencing panic attacks. The families of dancers who had died during the plague were left to grapple with grief complicated by the bizarre nature of their loss. How do you mourn someone who died from dancing? How do you explain to future generations that your spouse, parent, or child was killed by an irresistible compulsion to move? The absurdity of the cause of death didn't diminish the reality of the loss, but it made the grieving process more complex and difficult. Memorial services for plague victims were complicated by the dancing nature of their deaths. Traditional funeral rites seemed inadequate for people who had died in such an unusual way, and families struggled to find appropriate ways to honor their loved ones' memories. Some chose to avoid mentioning the dancing entirely, preferring to focus on the victims' lives before the plague. Others incorporated dance imagery into memorials, creating lasting records of how their relatives had died. The city government faced the enormous task of rebuilding not just the economy and infrastructure that had been damaged during the plague, but also the social fabric that had been torn by months of inexplicable crisis. Trust in institutions had been undermined by their inability to help during the plague, and people were left questioning whether their leaders could protect them from future inexplicable disasters. Recovery efforts focused initially on practical concerns, reopening businesses, resuming trade relationships, and restoring basic city services. But the psychological recovery took much longer, as residents struggled to process what they had experienced and witnessed. Some people developed a kind of survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been spared when others had been compelled to dance. Others lived in constant fear that the plague might return, jumping at sudden movements or avoiding music and dancing entirely. The trauma of witnessing mass involuntary dancing left lasting psychological scars on the entire community. Economic recovery was slow and difficult. Businesses that had closed during the plague struggled to reopen, lacking the capital and customer base needed to resume normal operations. Trade relationships that had been disrupted took time to re-establish, as other cities remained suspicious about the possibility of the plague recurring. The city had to rebuild its reputation as a safe and stable place to do business, a process that required not just time but active effort to convince outsiders that the dancing plague was truly over. This reputational rehabilitation involved hosting normal festivals and celebrations, demonstrating that Strasbourg could once again support ordinary human activities without supernatural interference. The medical community emerged from the plague humbled and somewhat reorganized. The complete failure of traditional treatments had forced physicians to confront the limitations of their knowledge and methods. Some doctors abandoned medicine entirely, unable to reconcile their training with their helplessness during the crisis. Others threw themselves into study and research, determined to understand what had happened and to be better prepared for similar future events. These physicians began corresponding with colleagues in other cities, sharing observations and theories in an early form of medical collaboration. Their work didn't lead to immediate breakthroughs, but it represented the beginning of a more empirical approach to medicine. The religious community also underwent significant changes following the plague. Some clergy members lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile the dancing plague with their understanding of divine justice and mercy. Others became more mystical and contemplative, viewing the plague as evidence of spiritual realities beyond human comprehension. The theological interpretations of the plague continued to evolve long after it ended. Some religious thinkers eventually concluded that it had been a test of faith, designed to strengthen the community's spiritual resolve. Others viewed it as a warning about the dangers of excessive worldliness or insufficient devotion. Still others abandoned attempts at theological explanation, concluding that some events were simply beyond human understanding. The artistic legacy of the dancing plague was perhaps more enduring than its immediate practical consequences. The visual and literary works created during and after the plague influenced European art for generations, introducing themes of involuntary action, inexplicable suffering, and the limits of human agency that would resurface in various forms throughout the Renaissance and beyond. Musicians were particularly affected by the plague, as their art had been directly implicated in both the problem and the attempted solutions. Some musicians stopped performing entirely, convinced that their art was somehow dangerous. Others developed new styles of music specifically designed to be calming and non-rhythmic, hoping to create art that couldn't possibly trigger involuntary dancing. The dancing plague also influenced the development of medical and scientific thinking more broadly. The complete failure of traditional explanations and treatments forced scholars to consider new approaches to understanding human behavior and disease. While these new approaches didn't immediately lead to better treatments, they contributed to the gradual development of more empirical and less theoretical approaches to medicine and natural philosophy. Educational curricula were eventually modified to include discussions of the dancing plague, though these lessons focused more on its moral and religious implications than on attempting to understand its actual causes. Students learned about the importance of faith during times of inexplicable trial, the dangers of excessive worldliness, and the need for community solidarity during crisis. Legal education also incorporated lessons from the dancing plague, particularly around the challenges of applying existing laws to unprecedented situations. Future lawyers and judges studied the legal responses to the plague as examples of how institutions could adapt to extraordinary circumstances while maintaining some semblance of order and justice. The plague's impact on family structures was profound and lasting. Families that had lost members to the dancing developed new traditions and practices around grief and memory. Some families became closer, bonded by their shared experience of helplessness and loss. Others were torn apart by the stress and trauma of watching loved ones suffer without being able to help. Marriage customs were also affected, as young people who had witnessed the plague became more cautious about forming deep attachments, fearing that they might have to watch future spouses dance themselves to death. Some couples who had planned to marry delayed their weddings until they were certain the plague was truly over. Child rearing practices changed as well, as parents who had seen children affected by the plague became more protective and anxious about their own children's safety. Some families avoided music and dancing entirely, fearing that exposure to rhythm might somehow trigger a recurrence of the compulsion. The social hierarchies that had characterized medieval Strasbourg were somewhat disrupted by the plague, as wealth and status provided no protection against the dancing compulsion. Rich and poor, noble and common, all were equally vulnerable to whatever force was causing the dancing. This equality and vulnerability created a temporary sense of shared humanity that transcended normal class divisions. However, the recovery period saw a reassertion of these traditional hierarchies, as wealthy families were better positioned to rebuild their lives and businesses after the plague ended. The temporary equality of suffering gave way to the permanent inequality of resources and opportunities. The dancing plague also influenced folk culture and oral traditions in Strasbourg and surrounding regions. Stories about the plague were passed down through generations, evolving and embellishing with each telling. These folk versions of the story often included supernatural elements and moral lessons that weren't present in the historical records, but served important psychological and social functions for communities processing collective trauma. Children's games and songs began to incorporate elements from the dancing plague, though usually in ways that transformed the horror into something more manageable for young minds. These playful adaptations of tragic events are a common way that cultures process and integrate traumatic experiences into their collective memory. The plague also influenced local superstitions and protective practices. People developed new rituals and taboos designed to prevent future occurrences of similar events. Some families avoided dancing entirely, while others only danced at specific times or in specific ways thought to be safe. These protective practices persisted for generations, becoming part of the local cultural fabric. Religious practices were permanently altered in some communities, with new prayers and observances specifically designed to prevent future dancing plagues. Some churches instituted annual memorial services for plague victims, while others added special protections against involuntary dancing to their regular liturgies. The economic systems that developed during the plague recovery period influenced Strasbourg's commercial development for decades afterward. The experience of economic disruption had taught the city's leaders valuable lessons about diversification and resilience, leading to policies that made the city's economy less vulnerable to future disruptions. Trade relationships that had been established with other cities during the search for medical and spiritual assistance to help with the plague became permanent commercial connections. In some ways, the plague's aftermath contributed to Strasbourg's integration into broader European trade networks, as the city worked to rebuild its reputation and economic base. The legal precedents established during the plague influenced how future unusual events would be handled by the courts. The experience of trying to apply normal laws to extraordinary circumstances led to the development of more flexible legal frameworks that could be adapted to unprecedented situations. These legal innovations were small but significant contributions to the gradual evolution of European legal systems, demonstrating how traumatic events could sometimes catalyze positive institutional changes, even amid terrible human suffering. The medical knowledge gained from observing the dancing plague, while limited by the scientific understanding of the time, contributed to the gradual accumulation of empirical knowledge about human behavior and disease. Physicians who had witnessed the plague carried their observations to other cities and countries, sharing their experiences with colleagues and contributing to the slow development of more scientific approaches to medicine. The detailed records kept during the plague also provided valuable historical documentation, that would be studied by future generations of physicians and scholars. These records, while influenced by the limited understanding of their time, preserved important details about the plague's progression and the various treatments that were attempted. The psychological understanding that emerged from the plague experience, though limited by medieval concepts of mental health, represented an early recognition that some human behaviors might be involuntary and might require different types of care and treatment than physical ailments. This recognition contributed to the gradual development of more nuanced approaches to mental health and behavioral disorders. The social support systems that developed during the plague also had lasting influence on how the community responded to future crises. The networks of mutual aid and care that emerged during the dancing plague became models for how the city could mobilize resources and support during other emergencies. These support systems were particularly important for families who had lost breadwinners to the plague, as the community developed new ways of providing for widows, orphans, and others who had been left vulnerable by the deaths of dancing relatives. The experience of collective crisis had created a stronger sense of community responsibility for the welfare of all residents. The artistic works created during and after the plague became part of Strasbourg's cultural heritage, influencing local artistic traditions for generations. The themes of helplessness, inexplicable suffering, and community resilience that emerged from plague. Related art continued to appear in local artistic works long after the plague itself was over. These artistic traditions also served as a form of collective memory, preserving the emotional and psychological reality of the plague experience in ways that purely historical records could not capture. Art became a vehicle for transmitting the lessons and feelings of the plague to future generations who had not experienced it directly. The intellectual legacy of the plague was equally significant. The complete failure of existing knowledge systems to explain or address the dancing compulsion forced scholars to begin questioning fundamental assumptions about human nature, disease causation, and the limits of human knowledge. This intellectual humility, born from the experience of witnessing something completely inexplicable, contributed to the gradual development of more empirical and less dogmatic approaches to learning and understanding. The dancing plague became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that existing knowledge was complete or adequate to address all possible situations. The religious legacy was more complex, as different communities and individuals drew different spiritual lessons from the plague experience. Some concluded that it demonstrated the importance of faith and submission to divine will, even when that will was incomprehensible. Others drew the opposite conclusion, questioning whether a truly benevolent deity would allow such inexplicable suffering. These theological debates continued long after the plague ended, influencing local religious thought and practice in ways that shaped the community's spiritual development for generations. The plague became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of divine justice, the problem of evil, and the limits of human understanding of God's plan. The political consequences were also significant, as the city government's inability to effectively respond to the plague raised questions about the competence and authority of local leadership. Some citizens concluded that their leaders had done everything possible under impossible circumstances, while others believed that better leadership might have found solutions that were missed. These political tensions influenced elections and appointments for years after the plague, as voters and officials tried to determine what qualities and qualifications would be most important for leaders who might face similar unprecedented crises in the future. The plague had demonstrated that normal political and administrative skills might be inadequate for extraordinary circumstances. International relationships were also permanently affected by the plague experience. Strasbourg's isolation during the crisis had demonstrated both the city's vulnerability and its resilience, influencing how other political entities viewed and interacted with the city in subsequent years. The diplomatic relationships that were formed during the search for outside assistance during the plague became permanent parts of Strasbourg's international network. The crisis had forced the city to reach out for help in ways that created new political and economic connections with other regions. By the time the last dancer had recovered or died, Strasbourg had been fundamentally changed by the experience. The city that emerged from the dancing plague was different from the one that had existed before Frau Trophia took her first involuntary step. It was a community that had been forced to confront the limits of human understanding and control, and that had somehow survived an experience that challenged everything its residents thought they knew about reality. The physical scars of the plague were eventually healed. The economic damage was repaired. The disrupted institutions were rebuilt. But the psychological and spiritual impact of witnessing mass involuntary dancing lasted much longer, shaping the community's collective memory and identity in ways that persisted for generations. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as one of history's most bizarre and disturbing events, a reminder that reality is stranger and more fragile than we usually like to admit. It was a collective breakdown of some fundamental human system that we still don't fully understand, a mass malfunction of the interface between mind and body that trapped hundreds of people in their own rebellious flesh. The fact that we still can't adequately explain what happened in Strasbourg that summer is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the whole story. Modern medicine has offered various theories about mass psychogenic illness, ergot poisoning, and stress-induced psychological breakdowns. But none of these explanations fully account for the specific characteristics of the dancing plague. We are left with the same fundamental mystery that puzzled the people of 1580s. How can human bodies betray their owners so completely? How can the normal relationship between intention and action break down so catastrophically? How can people be trapped in behavior that they cannot control and that ultimately destroys them? The dancing plague forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of human agency and self-control. We like to believe that we are masters of our own bodies, that our actions reflect our conscious choices, that we have meaningful control over our behavior. The dancing plague suggests that this control is more fragile and conditional than we usually acknowledge. It also raises questions about the social and psychological factors that can influence individual behavior in extreme ways. The plague didn't affect people randomly. It spread through communities, suggesting that social connections and psychological influences played a role in determining who was affected and how severely. The role of suggestion and social contagion in the dancing plague is particularly intriguing and disturbing. The sight of other people dancing apparently contributed to the spread of the compulsion, as if the behavior itself was somehow infectious. This suggests something troubling about human psychology and our susceptibility to being influenced by the actions of others, even when those actions are clearly harmful. The medieval response to the plague, while largely ineffective, reveals important things about how communities respond to inexplicable crises. The combination of practical attempts at help, religious explanations, and desperate improvisation that characterized Strasbourg's response to the plague is probably typical of how human communities deal with events that challenge their understanding of reality. The tendency to blame the victims, to assume that people who are suffering must somehow deserve their suffering, was present during the dancing plague just as it is during contemporary crises. Some people genuinely believed that the dancers were somehow choosing their fate, either through moral failing or deliberate deception. This victim blaming served a psychological function for the non-affected population, providing the comfort of believing that they were safe because they were morally superior or more sensible than the dancers. It allowed people to maintain their sense of control and agency by attributing the dancers' fate to personal failings rather than random misfortune. The dancing plague also demonstrates the human need to find meaning and explanation even in meaningless and inexplicable events. The elaborate theological, medical, and astrological explanations that were developed during the plague served important psychological functions, even when they were factually wrong. These explanations provided the comfort of believing that someone understood what was happening, that there was some underlying logic or purpose to the suffering, that the world was still fundamentally comprehensible, even when immediate experience suggested otherwise. The need for explanation was so strong that people preferred wrong explanations to no explanations at all. The plague's end was as mysterious as its beginning. By autumn of 1518, the compulsion to dance had simply faded away, leaving behind a community forever changed by their encounter with the inexplicable. The dancers who survived were physically and psychologically scarred but alive. The families who had lost loved ones were left to rebuild their lives around permanent holes in their hearts. The city itself bore the scars of the plague for years afterward. Buildings that had been damaged during the chaotic months of dancing were slowly repaired. Economic systems that had been disrupted were gradually restored. Social institutions that had proven inadequate during the crisis were reformed and strengthened. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the dancing plague was the knowledge that normal life, with all its predictable routines and reliable systems, was more fragile than anyone had previously imagined. The plague had demonstrated that human society could be disrupted by forces that no one understood, and that even the most basic assumptions about human behavior and self-control could be challenged by inexplicable events. This knowledge was both terrifying and liberating. It was terrifying because it suggested that security and predictability were illusions, that anyone could be affected by forces beyond their understanding or control. But it was also liberating because it freed people from the burden of believing that they could control everything that happened to them and their communities. The dancing plague became a cautionary tale about the limits of human knowledge and control, but it also became a story about human resilience and adaptability. The people of Strasbourg had survived an impossible situation, had found ways to care for each other and maintain some semblance of community, even while their world was falling apart in the most absurd way possible. The memory of the plague was preserved in various forms of official records, artistic works, folk tales, and family stories passed down through generations. Each form of preservation emphasized different aspects of the experience, from the factual details of who was affected and when, to the emotional reality of watching loved ones suffer inexplicably. These different forms of memory served different psychological and social functions for the community. Official records provided the comfort of documentation and historical legitimacy. Artistic works offered emotional processing and catharsis. Folk tales allowed for creative interpretation and moral instruction. Family stories maintained personal connections to the event and honored the memory of those who had been affected. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most puzzling events, a mass outbreak of involuntary behavior that killed dozens of people and traumatized an entire community. It stands as a reminder that human experience includes possibilities that are stranger and more disturbing than we usually acknowledge, and that our understanding of human nature and behavior is still incomplete and fragile. Modern attempts to explain the dancing plague have proposed various theories, from ergot poisoning to mass hysteria to stress-induced psychological breakdown. But none of these explanations fully capture the specific characteristics of what happened in Strasbourg that summer, and we are left with the same fundamental mystery that puzzled medieval observers. Perhaps this inability to fully explain the dancing plague is itself significant. It suggests that human experience includes elements that resist rational explanation, that are scientific and medical knowledge, while vastly superior to medieval understanding, is still incomplete and may always be incomplete. The dancing plague forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that consciousness and agency are more fragile and conditional than we like to believe, that the normal relationship between mind and body can break down in ways that we cannot predict or prevent. It reminds us that human beings are more vulnerable and less in control of their own actions than we usually care to acknowledge. But the plague also demonstrates something remarkable about human resilience and compassion. In the face of inexplicable tragedy, the people of Strasbourg found ways to care for each other, to maintain community bonds, and to preserve hope even while their world seemed to be ending in the most absurd way possible. The families who watched over dancing relatives, the musicians who tried to provide comfort through their art, the physicians who continued trying treatments even when nothing worked, the religious leaders who offered spiritual support even when their theology seemed inadequate. All of these people demonstrated a kind of heroism that had nothing to do with understanding what was happening, and everything to do with refusing to abandon each other in the face of the incomprehensible. The dancing plague of 1518 was a tragedy, but it was also a testament to the human capacity to maintain love, hope, and community even under the most bizarre and challenging circumstances. It was proof that people can survive events that seemed to make no sense, and that human connection and compassion can persist even when everything else seems to be falling apart. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of the dancing plague, not that inexplicable things can happen, which we already knew, but that people can survive inexplicable things and still maintain their humanity. The dancers of Strasbourg were victims of something we still don't understand, but they were also part of a community that refused to abandon them, that kept trying to help even when help seemed impossible, that maintained love and hope in the face of absurd tragedy. Their story reminds us that while we cannot control everything that happens to us, we can control how we respond to what happens to us. We can choose compassion over cruelty, community over isolation, hope over despair, even when we don't understand what's happening or why. The dancing plague was a breakdown of normal human experience, but the response to it was an affirmation of the best aspects of human nature. And so the summer of 1518 ended, the dancers stopped dancing, and Strasbourg slowly returned to something resembling normal life. But the memory of that strange and terrible time remained, woven into the city's history and identity, a reminder that reality is stranger than we imagine, and that human beings are both more fragile and more resilient than we usually believe. The plague was over, but its lessons would last forever, passed down through generations as both warning and inspiration, proof that people can survive anything, even the impossible, as long as they don't give up on each other.